Arthur Greenwood defending Richard Nixon. I have to see this. Given my last response to Arthur Greenwood was based around him defending the war on drugs, I figured I might as well open this commentary by mentioning his discussion of the same topic here.
During the 60s, drugs were becoming a huge problem, not only among hippies, but also among soldiers who were returning from Vietnam with crippling drug addictions, as they would use marijuana to cope with the pain and stress of war.
This is in reference to a rather common claim at the time the military was full of drug addicts during the Vietnam War, which is today understood to be little more than a claim made by sensationalist media, as opposed to something that was based in reality. To quote from a paper on this topic, Pentagon studies determined that only a small percentage of GIs recorded heavy or daily drug use in Vietnam. One typical survey determined that nearly 50% of those who smoked marijuana did so fewer than 10 times. Another concluded that fewer than 10% of soldiers used drugs more than 2 or 3 times. Major Edmund Casper, a psychiatrist based in Chulai, reported, quote, "Many individuals report that marijuana was either unrewarding or unpleasant and indicate no desire to repeat the experience. Chronic abuse was in the minority." In a 1976 article summarizing the available scientific literature, Dr. Morris Duke Stanton, who served at a medical facility near the demilitarized zone along Vietnam's 17th parallel, concluded that there was, quote, "no hard evidence that performance of duty in Vietnam was seriously affected by drugs. One key reason," he explained, "was that a majority of GIs got high almost exclusively while on rest and recuperation leave, or rear support bases, or during lulls in combat. A quantitative study found that fewer than 10% of men admitted to the use of marijuana on duty at some time. Within the Air Force, the figure was only 2.6%. Having interviewed over 500 military personnel, psychiatrist W.B. Postal found that the usual habit was to smoke the drug after a battle to calm down. Only one person indicated that he smoked it while fighting. Frank Bartimeau, Assistant General Counsel for the Department of Defense, reached a similar conclusion. We have very little, about no drug abuse among troops going into the field. Guys who use it say they never do it when they're going into combat, and there is no evidence that any mission has been jeopardized. So no, they weren't coming back with crippling drug addictions. Now, they were using marijuana to cope with the stress of war. That is somewhat true, albeit the exact numbers were nowhere near as high as much of the public thought at the time. But that's not the same thing as having a crippling addiction. In fact, alcoholism was a far bigger problem among soldiers in Vietnam than drug addiction was. Well, okay, assuming we don't count alcohol as a drug, even though it meets the definition of one, you know what I mean. By the way, Arthur, what do you think of alcohol again?
Okay, listen, I'm not a fan of the prohibition. I think alcohol is a good thing. It's a social lubricant and a fun tradition. I like a Jameson or a Kilkenny as much as the next guy. To fight this problem, Nixon began the war on drugs.
That was the justification the administration gave to the American people. However, evidence shows it was not the actual reason. The most well-known piece of proof being the famous quote from Nixon's domestic affairs advisor John Ehrlichman about them not being able to make it illegal to be against the Vietnam War or black. I should also note that Greenwood plays some clips from Tucker Carlson just in between his talking about Watergate. I'm going to cover them right now to get them out of the way.
Richard Nixon believed that elements in the federal bureaucracy were working to undermine the American system of government, and had been doing that for a long time. On June 23, 1972, Nixon met with the then CIA Director Richard Helms at the White House. Nixon suggested he knew, quote, who shot John, meaning President John F. Kennedy. Nixon further implied that the CIA was directly involved in Kennedy's assassination, which we now know it was. Helms's telling response? Total silence.
Okay, first off, the conversation being talked about happened in October of 1971, not June of 1972. Nixon also didn't say he knew who shot John. He was asking who was involved and said the president needed to be fully aware of what the intelligence agencies knew regarding the assassination. With him saying in the same recording, quote, "Is Eisenhower to blame? Is Johnson to blame? Is Kennedy to blame? Is Nixon to blame? Etc., etc., etc." It may become, not by me, but it may become a very, very vigorous issue. If it does, I need to know what is necessary to protect, frankly, the intelligence gathering and the dirty tricks department, and I will protect it. Hey, listen, I have done more than my share of lying to protect you, and I believe it's totally right to do it. Also, we don't know the CIA was involved with the Kennedy assassination, and Carlson gives no evidence to back up that claim. Side note, if the deep state really was targeting poor Richard Nixon, why did it allow him to win in 1972? The full clip directly sees Carlson acknowledging that Nixon won in a massive landslide in 1972.
Richard Nixon was reelected in 1972 by the largest margin of the popular vote ever recorded before or since. Nixon got 17 million more votes than his opponent.
When if the deep state, which, reminder, Carlson just said could assassinate a president roughly a decade before this, wanted him gone, why not just rig the 72 election? That seems like it would be far easier than this bizarre plan the deep state was apparently engaging in against the man who they apparently hated so much they let become president twice. I should note, one of the recurring themes in this video is that Nixon was some kind of underdog who was fighting for good against those damn elitists. This is first stressed while talking about Nixon's college years. Basically, all you need to know is there was a prestigious literary club called the Franklins at the university Nixon attended that rejected him because of his working class origins. This part of the video isn't bad, by the way. In fact, the biographical parts of this video are actually pretty damn good, all things considered. My biggest complaint is his audio mixing is just not all that great. It's the same problem I had at certain parts in the last video of his I covered, funnily enough. He just keeps his music too loud. Anyway, he goes on to connect this to the 1960 election by essentially casting JFK as a Franklin.
JFK was the ultimate Franklin. Good-looking, daddy's money, life handed to him on a silver platter, effortlessly rich and cool as Nixon could never be. While Nixon had to work for everything he ever got, Kennedy got everything he wanted thanks to his father's wealth and influence.
Okay, that is just completely untrue. Kennedy had to work incredibly hard to get the 1960 Democratic nomination. Kennedy had to work incredibly hard to convince party bigwigs that he would be a good choice due to a combination of his lack of political power and fears that his Roman Catholicism would alienate Protestant voters who were incredibly prejudiced against this group of Christians.
Kennedy was handsome and charismatic. Nixon was not.
We then get a quick recap of the 1960 presidential debates. He calls them the first televised presidential debates, which, technically speaking, isn't actually true. It was just the first time the two nominations from both parties debated. But the debate between Adlai Stevenson and Estes Kefauver in 1956 was still a televised presidential debate, albeit it was by two candidates competing for the nomination, while again, both Kennedy and Nixon had already gotten the nominations of their respective parties and were campaigning in the general election at the time. He also repeats the long-discussed myth that it was Kennedy's great performance in the debates which caused him to win the election, when there's just no evidence of that. Nixon was actually viewed as the winner in the second and third debate he held against Kennedy, with the fourth one being largely seen as a tie. Meanwhile, polls at the time found that the first debate, where these claims are based off of, show Kennedy to have tied Nixon on television while losing to Nixon on the radio, albeit that was primarily because of sampling bias regarding areas that didn't have television at the time. Yeah, this notion that JFK was some kind of television master who was able to swoon audiences, while Nixon couldn't make it sound like he really cared for Duff beer.
And now, a word from our sponsor.
I would like to take this opportunity to express my fondness for Duff beer.
I'd also like to express my fondness for that particular beer.
The man never drank a Duff in his life.
There's just not really any historical backing for it.
When Election Day came, Nixon was defeated. You can only imagine how that felt. It was the Franklins versus the Orthogenians all over again, and the smooth-talking Ivy League rich kid had crushed his ambitions.
And he ends the video by saying the following.
In the end, a small group of wealthy elites who only got their power because their rich fathers and their Ivy League connections ruined Nixon's career, his reputation, and his legacy. In the end, the Franklins won.
Mind you, Gallup polling from the time shows that when Nixon resigned, he had a 24% approval rating, with 57% of Americans thinking he should be removed from office. And this was just after this guy gave this long monologue about how the normal people stood up and that's why Nixon won.
The landslide that gave Nixon the most powerful position in the world was the last dying gasp of the old America. The normal Americans, the Americans who built this country, spoke with a unanimous voice and gave Nixon the popular mandate to save their way of life.
And then nearly 2 years later, the very same common people thought he was a terrible president who shouldn't be allowed in the White House. Fuck, at the time of his resignation, 30% of Republicans wanted him gone, showing that hatred of Nixon was even starting to enter his own party's mainstream. And none of this is even getting into how Republican politicians ended up turning on Nixon quite heavily as Watergate and other scandals from his administration began unfolding.
The first of many dishonest Watergate stories was written by a 29-year-old Metro reporter called Bob Woodward. Who exactly was Bob Woodward? Well, he wasn't a journalist. Bob Woodward had no background whatsoever in the news business.
He had spent a year as a local reporter in Montgomery, in between his time in the Navy and his working for the Washington Post.
Instead, Bob Woodward came directly from the classified areas of the federal government. He worked regularly with the intel agencies. Soon after leaving the Navy, for reasons that have never been clear, Woodward was hired by the most powerful news outlet in Washington and assigned the biggest story in the country.
Except it wasn't the biggest story at the time. It was a low-level break-in that was not taken seriously by the vast majority of the national media.
And just to make it crystal clear what was actually happening, Woodward's main source for his Watergate series was the deputy director of the FBI, Mark Felt. And Mark Felt ran, and we're not making this up, the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which was designed to secretly discredit political actors the federal agencies wanted to destroy. People like Richard Nixon.
The operation Carlson's talking about was shut down in 1971. The year before Felt became deputy FBI director, so his timeline is entirely off here.
In November 1972, President Richard Milhous Nixon was elected in a landslide. Nixon won every single state except Massachusetts, and he won 60% of the popular vote. It was one of the largest landslides in American history. 6 months later, Nixon resigned in shame, his reputation in tatters, his career ruined forever, and his entire administration embroiled in scandal.
It was actually closer to about 20 months later, not 6. Nixon was reelected in November of 1972. Meanwhile, he resigned in August of 1974.
Fun fact, there were actually charges of voter fraud in Texas and Illinois, 2 states that Kennedy won. There were also numerous reports of dead people voting, and in some precincts, the vote totaled more than the population. I'm sure Nixon was very tempted to contest the election, but ultimately, he decided that doing so would hurt America's reputation in the eyes of the world, so he accepted his defeat with grace.
Nixon was perfectly willing to fight the election, but Dwight Eisenhower's lack of support is what caused him not to do so. Also, the claims of more people voting in certain precincts than were actually there is just completely untrue. A lot of it has to do with the fact that Texas at the time had a poll tax that certain people were exempt from, and it was the number of people who paid said poll tax, which was the basis for the figures regarding population in that area. Yeah, this whole idea that Nixon had the 1960 election stolen from him, one that is quite popular in certain conservative circles, by the way, is just complete nonsense. To quote from a Salon article from 2000, although Republicans continued to insist that Illinois and Texas had somehow figured out a way to cheat and still pass a recount, they never produced hard evidence of widespread impropriety. Yet, that was certainly not for lack of trying. For over a month, the Republican efforts were aggressive and widespread, that Nixon was clever enough to allow his aides and political friends to do the work on his behalf, while officially seeming to remove himself from the fray, should not let Americans have amnesia about what really happened in the wake of the 1960 vote.
Nixon represented a new breed of Republican, one that believed in common sense and pragmatism over high ideals.
With the exception of Goldwater, that was the vast majority of mainstream Republicans, though, at least from the New Deal onwards until about Reagan. Goldwater even noted at the opening of Conscious of a Conservative, his very famous political manifesto, that many people were falling in line with the Nixonian and Eisenhower idea of attempting to sort of defend themselves from the label Goldwater embraced, saying, "I have been much concerned that so many people today with conservative instincts feel compelled to apologize for them, or if not, to apologize directly, to qualify their commitment in a way that amounts to breastbeating. Republican candidates, Vice President Nixon has said, should be economic conservatives, but conservatives with a heart. President Eisenhower announced during his first term, 'I am a conservative when it comes to economic problems, but liberal when it comes to human problems.' Still, other Republican leaders have insisted on calling themselves progressive conservatives. These formulations are tantamount to an admission that conservatism is a narrow, mechanistic economic theory that may work well as a bookkeeper's guide, but cannot be relied upon as a comprehensive political philosophy." This book was published in 1960, 8 years before Nixon was elected president, so this idea that Nixon was a new era of Republican, you know, to the extent that somebody elected to Congress over 20 years previously by your own information could be considered new,
In 1946, Nixon was elected to the House of Representatives.
is utter nonsense.
He actually endorsed parts of the Civil Rights Movement and the New Deal.
Again, that was true for a lot of the RNC at the time. See Dwight Eisenhower, you know, the person Nixon was the second in command for, famously saying in 1954 that, "Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history." To give just one example, this was a point in history where the Rockefeller Republicans, or Republicans that tended to be liberal on basically every issue except crime and foreign policy, still had a lot of sway within the party. Nixon even ran as sort of a compromise between the Rockefeller Republicans and the conservatives in the 1968 Republican primary, with the Rockefeller Republicans being represented by, well, Nelson Rockefeller, and the conservatives being represented by Ronald Reagan.
As you might imagine, this offended the hardcore libertarians of the party.
And his examples of hardcore libertarians were Milton Friedman and, of all people, former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was an authoritarian neoconservative, not a libertarian.
And of course, Nixon ended the Vietnam War. In his first year, he ended the draft and began bringing the troops home.
Nixon didn't end the draft until 1973, long after his first year in office. Nixon's re-election campaign even attacked McGovern for supporting amnesty for draft dodgers, or people who refused to be drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. That's where the use of the word amnesty in the phrase acid amnesty and abortion, a smear used against George McGovern in 1972, came from.
If you're anything like me, you're probably thinking, okay, that's cool and all, but why didn't he just withdraw as soon as he was elected? Well, look what happened in Afghanistan. Under Biden, we pulled out all our troops in a hurry, and it was a total disaster. You have to retreat strategically. In Nixon's words, you must ensure peace with honor.
Really? So roughly 15,000 more people died in the war while Nixon was planning on withdrawing anyway for the sake of honor? What exactly is honorable about that? And none of this is even getting into how Nixon expanded the Vietnam War to include neighboring countries Laos and Cambodia. And that's not even getting into the sabotaging of Johnson's peace talks in 1968, which the Nixon campaign did so he could win the election in the first place.
You've probably been told that the evil, sneaky Nixon sent his goons to break into Watergate and hide listening devices. But the truth is, Nixon never authorized this burglary. He didn't even know about it until after it happened. So put yourself in Nixon's shoes. The mainstream media hates you. They're desperately searching for something, anything, to bring you down.
Funny you say that, given, if anything, the media was incredibly biased in favor of Nixon. George McGovern once recounted how his decision to change running mates, along with the fact that his first choice for a running mate had, gasp, undergone treatment for depression, got more media attention than the entire Watergate scandal during the 1972 campaign.
The national press wasn't very responsible at that time. I don't condemn the press, they doing what they thought was right, but they spent far more ink dwelling on my mishandling of the vice presidential selection than was ever devoted to the Watergate break-in on the part of the Nixon people during the campaign. It was hard to get them interested in that.
You find out that your agents committed a crime. Do you immediately tell everyone, giving the media the scandal they need to destroy your reputation? Do you give the communists exactly what they need to win?
And his evidence that Nixon thought the communists winning was going to happen if he came forward about Watergate early on? Yeah, he doesn't have any. Anyway, final thoughts. This video had a lot wrong with it. Good night and good luck.